Our next speaker today is Danielle Leppert-Siemenauer, relatively new developer at ThoughtWorks, about a year into her journey here, doing some really interesting work with a coalition trying to attack some of the sustainability goals, creating this platform called SustainChain. Danielle will tell you all about it. So Danielle, welcome to the stage.
Thank you. All right, well, let's get started. My name is Danielle Leppert-Siemenauer. I am a software developer consultant here at ThoughtWorks. I have been here for about 1 year, and I am currently working on the same first project that I was staffed on, SustainChain, which is the subject of my talk today. What does it mean to create a public utility? And before we begin, I believe that it's important for me to point out that the purpose of this talk is not to convince anyone that SustainChain is a public utility. It's to explore a sample of the questions that we have to ask ourselves when we are considering what we are going to do to have to build this platform and call it a public utility at some point in the future in good faith. And my hope is that within exploring these questions gives us some insight into what it means to intentionally create a public utility, especially in the 21st century. So we're going to rewind back in time to the year 1641. For the past 5 years, the colonial settlers in the town of Dedham, Massachusetts had struggled, spending hours and hours every single day grinding and grinding their corn by hand down until it was flour. And after several attempts of getting a mill expert to the area, the colony was finally able to get one. John Elderkin agreed to move to Dedham to build a grist mill for the community in exchange for 3 acres of land along the river. And once he was able to do this, the community was able to come and grind down their corn orders of magnitude faster than they were before. This grist mill in Dedham, Massachusetts, was the first public utility in what would become the United States of America. So let's take a second to get on the same page with a couple of important definitions. A public service is any service meant to benefit all of the members of a community. And a public utility is an organization that provides infrastructure to maintain a public service, and it's subject to government regulation for reasons we'll get into more at the end of this presentation. If a public service is any service that is meant to address the specific needs of a community, and if the only way for the community of Earth to survive is by protecting our planet and the people on it, then I can't think of any better entity more deserving of the term public utility than SustainChain. And that's exactly how this conversation started. SustainChain is a platform owned by the United States Coalition on Sustainability. The U.S. Coalition on Sustainability is a nonprofit organization established in collaboration with the United Nations for the single purpose of unifying and accelerating progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Sustainable Development Goals, commonly referred to as SDGs, are 17 interlinked goals for a more sustainable future set out by the UN in 2015. On SustainChain, users can connect with other innovators, investors, business leaders, academics, governments, nonprofits, and beyond. And together, they can form groups based off of common interests, SDG goals, and the likes. Most interestingly, they can create these cool little things called action initiatives, which are essentially projects related to making progress on SDGs. Users can come up with goals for their action initiative and track their progress of those goals. Now, users have been able to create action initiatives and connect with other users, but a new development has been learning that people in the sustainability space are quite siloed from each other and want direction for what to do and who to connect with. Enter DaVinci. About a month ago, we started a new stream with USES called DaVinci. DaVinci will be a machine learning layer in SustainChain that will intelligently recommend action initiatives and groups to join and users to follow or connect with on the platform. The goal of this stream is to use this newfound intelligence to drive action and accelerate the progress towards meeting SDGs at unprecedented rates. So now that we've covered what Sustain Chain is and the key definitions at play here, we can talk about what it would mean for Sustain Chain to be a public utility. To recap, a public utility provides a public service, which provides a benefit to a community available to all. And because of those two things, it is also subject to regulation. So the conversation about how we can, in the future, consider Sustain Chain to be a public utility is centered on meeting those three criteria. There are many conversations pertaining to each of these three criteria, but we're going to focus on one conversation per requirement. These are 1, measuring outcomes and proving good. 2, mitigating bias to eliminate discrimination. And finally, 3, governance to ensure good for all. Starting with number 1, measuring outcomes and promoting good. Let's start by understanding what it is we need to prove. If a public service provides a benefit to a particular community, and we want Sustain Chain to be considered a public utility that provides the public service of connecting people together to accelerate the progress of SDGs, then we need to definitively demonstrate that Sustain Chain provides the good to the community at aim here, that community being the world. But currently, the only metric that users have for measuring their progress towards a goal for an action they are taking is with this little feature at the bottom of this slide. It's a progress bar for the stage of the project that it's on. And that's great for now. It's an early version of the platform with lots and lots of room to grow. And the current priorities are to measure the volume and engagement of users with the SDGs. However, in the future, we are going to need to find a way for a group of people working on an action initiative together to be able to track their progress towards accomplishing their goal, and also whether or not that goal has made progress towards accomplishing an SDG. Now, this is the million-dollar question, because there are 17 different SDGs, and each and every one of them is different from the next. Let's take, for example, SDG 4. SDG 4 is for providing equitable education to all people, including women and girls in communities where education is discouraged for them. So let's say that an action initiative is to address this issue in a specific country. One of the many ways a member of this action initiative may want to measure their success is by how many women and girls have been given an education that did not have it before. So I want you to think for a second about what a feature for measuring this type of progress would look like. Now let's look at SDG 15, Life on Land. One goal under this umbrella is to promote forest rehabilitation globally. So a user of Sustain Chain may create an action initiative for planting trees. The metrics for success here, again, could be a lot of things, but for the sake of this simplistic example, let's say that the metric is how many trees have been planted. As you can see, the metrics for success for providing women and girls with a quality education and forest rehabilitation are quite different. There's no one-size-fits-all metric when trying to measure progress against these action initiatives themselves or ultimately against an SDG. So let's take a second look at our action initiative addressing SDG 15, because there's another point I'd like to make here. Just because someone is planting a bunch of trees doesn't necessarily mean that they are promoting forest rehabilitation. If they aren't planting the right variation of tree species, for example, then the action initiative could be doing more harm than good. There are many companies right now doing that very thing. So it's extremely difficult to know whether or not these action initiatives are doing any good unless we give the users the ability to measure their progress in such a way that is meaningful to the uniqueness of the project itself, which would mean both a dynamic user interface and dynamic analytics. Moving on to our second topic, mitigating bias to eliminate discrimination. Remember that second criteria for a public utility is being indiscriminate. If a public service is available to all equally, and we want to consider Sustain Chain to be a public utility in the future that provides a public service, then Sustain Chain needs to be available to all. Let's lay the technical foundation for the second discussion by talking a little bit more about what DaVinci, our machine learning layer, does. DaVinci will take a recommendation to a user. That's what you can see at the top of this chart. And this can be something like, hey Jane, check out John Doe's profile, or you might like this action initiative. Then the user either does something with that recommendation that seems to indicate they might want to see more things like it, or the user does nothing with it. And this could be like clicking the recommendation or not clicking the recommendation. Those actions or lack of actions are then sent back to DaVinci as a positive or negative signal respectively, and DaVinci will then determine the probability that a new recommendation will result in a positive or negative signal and prioritize what it will recommend. One future possibility of particular interest here is recommending to follow users who seem to be popular on the platform, meaning, especially for this example, users who've been clicked on many times by other users on the platform. And with that future possibility, we run into a problem. Users who are already very popular, like for example, Elon Musk or Bill Gates, have a very easy time being recommended more, which takes away instances where other equally deserving members could be recommended. And this essentially means that Sustain Chain could be discriminating against those users because those users don't have a leg up already, which violates the second requirement of a public utility. Yet, if we don't promote users based on how other users are interested in them, then Sustain Chain isn't discriminating. But on the other hand, it means that it will create a lot of noise on the platform, which ultimately hinders progress towards SDGs. So without any solution, we find ourselves having to choose between being discriminatory and not providing the good that we are intending to provide. We really want something more in the middle. And the way we find the area in the middle is by using this thing called inverse propensity weighting, which creates a second probability model that predicts the treatment assignment. And let's get into more of what that means. We're going to calculate a probability that we make a recommendation to a user based on some criteria. For example, let's say we recommend to a user that they follow John Doe, because many people have clicked on John Doe. So there must be something great about John Doe, right? Well, we take the inverse of that probability, which becomes a weight, W, which we can then put into our regression model, which will then tell us something like, in this example, the probability that a user clicks on a recommendation for John Doe given the fact that we recommended it. And that's what we see here in this next diagram. Once we've completed those steps, we can use that bright and shiny regression model to determine the probability that we make another recommendation to the user in the future. And the cycle keeps continuing. DaVinci gets more and more intelligent. So back to the example of reinforcing popularity, without inverse propensity weighting, DaVinci may recommend a popular figure more at the expense of others. With inverse propensity weighting, DaVinci promotes users fairly, or in other words, DaVinci doesn't discriminate. And at the same time, we can still promote users to some degree that are doing great work still. So even with reinforcement learning, we can have bias in our data. We have ways to mitigate it, like inverse propensity weighting. When we are able to mitigate that bias, we can give everyone a fair chance and make the most of the platform while still rewarding good work. And the last topic we're going to get into is how to govern Sustain Chain to ensure that it achieves the benefit it sets out to provide to society and that it provides that service to all. So what do we need to talk about? Well, since public utilities are subject to regulation, and since we would like to consider Sustain Chain to be a public utility, we should probably talk about what governance of Sustain Chain might be like. The reason why public utilities need to be regulated is because there tend to be a huge barrier to entry for creating public services. Think the grist mill. It takes an enormous amount of effort to import all of those materials, build everything, keep it running. And so usually the first person to create a public service successfully becomes a natural monopoly. With little or no competition, those organizations are able to set the price for their service however they want to, or do things to that public service that can harm the greater good. Again, in the example of the colonial grist mills, this meant colonies were able to regulate the grist mills, tell them, for example, that they could only take 1/16 of the corn coming from the colonists, rather than however much they want. Some possible good news is that Sustain Chain, on the other hand, is owned by USCS, which is a nonprofit which is supported by the UN. This at least means that there isn't as much worry about Sustain Chain prioritizing profits over goods. However, we will need to still consider what Sustain Chain can do to ensure that the first two criteria that we've covered of a public service be met. Now, I want to make a distinction here because historically, public utilities have been regulated by their respective governments. But Sustain Chain and other potential public utilities in the 21st century might not, will have a more complicated question as far as how the respective governments would regulate them. So, and also a talk about how the government could regulate Sustain Chain would be a topic for another presentation. So what we're focusing on right now is how Sustain Chain could possibly govern itself for the same purposes that traditional public utilities of the past have been governed. Which brings us to our governing structure. One way that Sustain Chain plans to establish governance to ensure that it is accessible to all and provides the benefit to all is by becoming trusted source, which is kind of a play on open source. The dominating trusted source model would be one by one giving teams outside of ThoughtWorks and Sustain Chain access to work on particular parts of the platform. And each of these teams would form modules. And the idea here is that representatives from each of these modules in its trusted source ecosystem would be part of the governing body of Sustain Chain, balancing out some of the power and all having a say in making decisions that impact the good that Sustain Chain provides and its accessibility. That governing body will be able to make important decisions, such as how to identify bad actors in Sustain Chain that are hindering progress towards reaching SDG goals, and how to deal with them, among other complicated questions that will arise when trying to make this platform a technology that benefits all and is available to all. So a trusted source model for Sustain Chain's future has the added benefit of aiding a balanced governing body that can ensure that Sustain Chain be a platform that does good and is available to all who wish to use it. We set out on this discussion trying to determine what Sustain Chain would be like in order to call it a public utility in good faith. We covered three main criteria for a public utility: that it provides a benefit to its community, that it's available to all within that community, and that it tends to be regulated to ensure that those first two criteria be met. We covered one discussion for each of those three criteria. And firstly, we talked about how to measure the good we are doing in order to know that we are doing good. Second, we talked about how to mitigate bias on the platform while still maintaining a meritocracy so that we could honestly say that everyone has a fair chance on Sustain Chain. And thirdly, we talked about what governance might look like on Sustain Chain and the unique questions that the governing body will have to answer in order to ensure that Sustain Chain is both accessible to all and a benefit to humanity. As Sustain Chain successfully answers these questions, and so many more, to build this platform, it will hopefully be able to create what could be the public utility of all public utilities of the 21st century, ensuring the long-term well-being of our planet and our people. And with that, thank you.